He raised his hand and slapped me in front of 40 strangers, all because I spilled coffee on his $5 shirt. Nobody moved to help me, nobody knew who I was, but 30 seconds later his face went white as a sheet because my husband had just walked through that door. Before we start, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because this story has a twist near the end that nobody sees coming. Comment the word justice below if you think he deserved what was coming to him. Now let's go back to where it all began. My name is Sloane, and before I tell you what happened on that Tuesday morning, I need you to understand who I was before it. I was not the kind of woman people noticed when I walked into a room. I wore plain clothes, simple shoes, no jewelry that sparkled, no bags with shiny logos. I parked my own small car 2 streets away from anywhere I needed to be because I liked walking. I liked the quiet of an ordinary morning. You would never guess, looking at me, that I was married to one of the wealthiest men in the entire country. I know how that sounds, like a fairy tale, like something made up for a movie, but it was my real life and I chose it to look exactly the way it looked. Quiet, unnoticed, mine. My husband built his company from almost nothing. He started in a small rented office with 2 employees and a borrowed printer. By the time I met him, he had already grown that small company into something massive, something with his name on buildings in cities I had never even visited. But none of that mattered to me when I fell in love with him. What mattered was the way he listened when I talked. The way he remembered small details, like how I liked my tea, or that I hated when people interrupted me mid-sentence. When we got married, the world expected me to change. They expected designer dresses and private drivers and a calendar full of charity galas. And for a while I tried some of that, I really did, but it never felt like me. It felt like wearing a costume every single day. So one evening, about a year into our marriage, I sat my husband down and told him the truth. I don't want to be someone else, I said. I want to keep walking to the coffee shop on the corner. I want to keep wearing my old sweater on rainy days. I want people to talk to me like I'm just a person, not like I'm your wife. He looked at me for a long moment and then he smiled, not the polished smile he gave at business dinners but the real one, the one that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. Then that's who you'll be, he said. I fell in love with that woman, I'm not going to ask her to disappear. So that's how I lived, quiet mornings, simple coffee, a life that looked from the outside completely ordinary. And that ordinary life is exactly what made that Tuesday morning so painful, because for those few minutes nobody knew who I really was. I was just a woman who had made a mistake, and in that crowd that meant I didn't matter at all. That morning started like any other. I woke up early before my husband and made my way to the small coffee shop a few blocks from our home. It was the kind of place most people walked past without noticing, a narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign and mismatched chairs inside. But the coffee was good, and the woman who ran the counter always remembered my order. The shop was busier than usual that day. There was some kind of business meeting happening at the corner table, a group of men in expensive suits talking loudly about numbers and deals. One man in particular stood out. He sat with his shoulders back, his chin lifted, the way people sit when they want everyone around them to know they're important. I didn't know his name yet. I would learn it soon enough, and so would the rest of that coffee shop. He was rude to the young woman behind the counter from the moment he walked in. He complained that his order was taking too long, even though only 2 minutes had passed. He snapped his fingers at her like she was furniture instead of a person. I watched her hands shake slightly as she worked, and something in my chest tightened with quiet anger. I have never understood people who treat workers like they're beneath them. It says more about the person doing the treating than the person receiving it. I got my coffee and turned to find a seat. The shop was crowded that morning, more crowded than usual, and as I walked between the tables, trying to balance my drink and my bag, someone shifted their chair back without looking. I didn't see it coming. My foot caught the edge of the chair leg and my whole body lurched forward. The hot coffee in my hand splashed out of the cup and landed directly across the front of his shirt, the man from the corner table, the one who had been so cold to the young woman at the counter. For 1 second, the entire shop went silent. I started apologizing immediately. I grabbed a handful of napkins from the nearest table and reached out to help him. "I am so sorry," I said. "It was an accident, I tripped, please let me." He stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. His face had turned a deep shade of red and his eyes were narrow with rage. "Do you know how much this shirt cost?" he shouted. I froze, the napkins still in my hand. "I'm sorry," I said again, softer this time. "I'll pay for it, I'll have it cleaned, I'll replace it, whatever you need." "You'll replace it," he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You clumsy woman, look at you. You can't even walk through a room without destroying something." People around us had stopped talking. I could feel their eyes on me, but no one said a word, no one stood up, no one told him to calm down. I felt my face grow hot with embarrassment. "It really was an accident," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's no need to speak to me like that." That's when he raised his hand. I didn't even have time to flinch before his palm struck the side of my face. The sound of it cracked through the quiet coffee shop like a gunshot. My head turned with the force of it, and I stumbled back a step, my hand flying up to my cheek, which was already burning hot. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything. There was only a ringing in my ears and the sting spreading across my skin. Tears welled up in my eyes, not from the pain, but from the shock of it, from the humiliation of being struck in front of strangers, none of whom moved to help me. I looked around the room. I saw faces frozen in discomfort. I saw people lowering their eyes, pretending suddenly to be very interested in their phones or their coffee cups. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody said his behavior was wrong. In that moment, I was just a clumsy woman who had spilled coffee, and he was a man with money and confidence, and apparently that was enough to make a whole room of people stay silent. I stood there with my hand against my cheek, my eyes stinging, feeling smaller than I had felt in years. And then I heard the bell above the door. I didn't turn around right away. I was still trying to steady my breathing, still trying to blink back the tears I refused to let fall in front of this man, but I noticed the shift in the room before I understood why. The quiet discomfort in the shop changed into something else, a kind of stillness that felt different, heavier. I heard footsteps, slow, even, deliberate footsteps crossing the wooden floor, and then I felt a presence beside me, close enough that I recognized it before I even looked. My husband. He must have come to surprise me with breakfast like he sometimes did when his morning meetings got canceled. He was dressed simply that day too, in a plain shirt, nothing flashy, nothing that would tell a stranger he was worth more money than most people could imagine. That was something we always had in common, neither of us needed to announce who we were. But the moment his eyes landed on the red mark blooming across my cheek, something in his expression changed completely. I had seen my husband angry before. I had seen him frustrated during difficult business calls, tired after long negotiations, even short-tempered on rare stressful days. But I had never seen what I saw on his face in that moment. It wasn't loud anger, it wasn't shouting or red faces or raised fists. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. A stillness in his eyes that made the temperature in the room feel like it dropped several degrees. He didn't even look at me first. His gaze moved past me, locking onto the man still standing there with coffee stains across his ruined shirt. "Did you put your hand on my wife?" my husband asked. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it that made the entire shop go completely silent. The man, the one who moments ago had seemed so powerful, so certain of his own importance, opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. His eyes darted from my husband's face to mine, and I watched something change in his expression: recognition, realization, and then, unmistakably, fear. I didn't know," he stammered. "She spilled coffee on me, and I reacted without thinking." "You reacted," my husband repeated slowly, "by striking a woman across the face, in public, in front of children." He glanced toward a nearby table where a mother sat with two young kids, both of them staring wide-eyed at the scene. "In front of people who could have stepped in and chose not to because apparently your money makes you untouchable." The man's face had gone pale, all that earlier redness drained completely away. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't realize who she was if I had known." "That's the problem," my husband said, cutting him off. "It shouldn't matter who she is. You don't put your hands on anyone, not my wife, not the woman behind that counter you were rude to the moment you walked in here, not anyone." I watched the man's eyes flicker toward the young barista, who was standing frozen behind the counter, watching everything unfold with her hand pressed over her mouth. My husband finally turned to me, his expression softening instantly like a different person had taken over his face. He reached out and gently touched my chin, turning my face slightly so he could look at the mark left behind. His jaw tightened again when he saw it clearly, but his voice when he spoke to me was soft. "Are you all right?" he asked. I nodded even though my cheeks still throbbed and my chest still felt tight with humiliation. "I'm okay," I whispered. "It just surprised me." He pressed a soft kiss to my forehead, right there in front of everyone, and something about that small gesture made the tears I had been holding back finally spill over. Not because I was sad, because, for the first time since the slap, I felt safe again. The man who had struck me tried one more time to explain himself, his words tumbling out fast and desperate. "Sir, please, I run a company, I have investors, I have a family to think about, this could ruin everything for me, I'm asking you, please." My husband held up a single hand, and the man stopped talking instantly. "You should have thought about your family before you raised your hand," my husband said. "You should have thought about your investors before you decided it was acceptable to hit a woman over a coffee stain." He turned slightly toward the rest of the shop, his voice carrying clearly without ever rising into a shout. "Everyone in this room watched a man strike my wife and did nothing. I understand fear. I understand not wanting to get involved in something that isn't yours. But I want every person here to think about what kind of world we're building when we stay silent in moments like this." Nobody spoke. A few people lowered their heads, clearly ashamed. The young barista behind the counter wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. My husband reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't dial dramatically or make some grand show of power. He simply made one quiet phone call, speaking briefly to someone about reviewing certain business partnerships, certain contracts, certain investments that had recently been finalized with companies tied to the man standing in front of us. I learned later that the man's name was tied to a mid-sized logistics company, one that had just signed a major distribution deal, a deal that ran through one of my husband's companies, although the man clearly had no idea of that connection until that very moment. "That deal is finished," my husband said, simply ending the call. "I won't have my company associated with someone who treats people this way, not employees, not strangers, not anyone." The man's face crumbled. All that earlier arrogance, all that confidence he carried into the coffee shop that morning, evaporated completely. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now, "that deal took me 2 years to secure, it's everything for my company." "Then perhaps," my husband said quietly, "you'll remember this moment the next time you consider raising your hand at someone." He didn't shout, he didn't threaten violence in return. He simply turned, wrapped his arm gently around my shoulders and guided me toward the door, leaving the man standing there in his ruined, coffee-stained shirt, surrounded by the silence of people who had just watched his entire world begin to collapse. In the days that followed, I learned just how far the consequences reached. The logistics deal was canceled formally within 48 hours. Word spread quickly through certain business circles, not because my husband made some public announcement, but because people talk, and people remember stories about a powerful man defending his wife after a public humiliation. Other partners began quietly distancing themselves too, unwilling to be associated with someone whose name was now connected to that kind of story. His investors grew uneasy. A few pulled their support entirely. Within 2 weeks, I heard through mutual acquaintances that his company was struggling to recover the momentum it once had. It wasn't that my husband made calls demanding people abandon him. It was simpler than that. People didn't want to do business with someone capable of treating another human being that way in public, especially once they learned exactly who that woman had turned out to be. I won't pretend I felt nothing about his downfall. Part of me, the part that still remembered the sting of his palm against my cheek and the humiliation of being struck in front of strangers, felt a quiet sense that he was finally facing something close to what he deserved. But another part of me, a bigger part, felt something different. I thought about the way he had spoken to that young woman behind the counter before any of this happened. I thought about how easily people excuse cruelty when it's aimed at someone they assume has no power to push back, and I realized something important. It shouldn't have taken my husband walking through that door for what happened to me to matter. That thought stayed with me for a long time afterward. If I had been exactly who I appeared to be that morning, just an ordinary woman with no wealthy husband, no powerful name attached to mine, would anyone in that shop have done anything different? Would the man have faced any consequences at all? Or would I have simply gone home that day, nursing a bruise and a wounded sense of dignity, with no one ever held accountable? I thought about all the people who experience moments like that every single day, without anyone showing up to defend them, without a powerful name walking through the door to change everything in an instant, and it made me determined to be different, to never again be a silent face in a crowd while someone else suffered. A few weeks after everything settled, I went back to that same coffee shop. The young barista recognized me immediately and came around the counter to hug me before I could even say anything. "I should have done something," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry I didn't." "It wasn't your job to fix what he did," I told her gently. "It was his." We talked for a while and I learned her name was something I won't share here, because this story was never about giving anyone else's identity away except my own. But I learned she had been struggling, working long hours to support her younger siblings, dealing with disrespectful customers on a near daily basis with no one ever standing up for her. Before I left that day, I made sure she knew that if anything like that ever happened again, to her or to anyone in that shop, she could call me directly. I gave her my number, not my husband's assistant, not some formal channel, me. It felt like the smallest thing, but sometimes the smallest things matter the most. As for the man who slapped me, I heard he eventually had to step down from leading his company entirely. The damage to his reputation never fully recovered. I won't say I felt joy about that. I felt something closer to peace. The understanding that actions, even ones we think no one is watching closely enough to notice, eventually catch up with us. My husband and I talked about that day many times in the weeks afterward. He told me something I've never forgotten. I wasn't angry because someone hurt my wife, he said one evening, holding my hand across the kitchen table. I was angry because someone hurt a person and assumed it didn't matter because he thought no one would care enough to stop him. That should never be true for anyone. I think about that often now, about how easy it is for cruelty to hide behind power and how important it is for someone, anyone, to be willing to stand up when they see it happening, whether or not the person being hurt has someone powerful walking through the door behind them. That morning changed something in me. It reminded me that dignity isn't something that depends on who you're married to or how much money sits in someone's bank account. It reminded me that every single person deserves to be treated with basic human respect, in coffee shops and boardrooms and every ordinary place in between. And it reminded me that sometimes the quietest people in the room, the ones nobody expects to matter, turn out to be far stronger and far more protected than anyone realized. If this story hit you right in the chest, smash that like button and let me know in the comments, would you have done what Sloane did? Subscribe now so you never miss what happens next, because trust me, the next story will leave you speechless. See you in the next video.